This is the Classical Top 5. I'm Tommy Pearson, and with me as always, Richard Bratby and Charlotte Gardner. This week's topic is a big one, and it's full of the opportunity to take it as you wish. It's top 5 myths about classical music. So I wonder what we'll all make of that. Well, our special guest is harpsichordist extraordinaire Mahan Esfahani, known not only for his performances of music across the ages up to the present day as concerto soloist and recitalist, but also as a writer and commentator on the world of classical music, and also pretty much anything else besides. Last week, I read a piece by him about that most controversial of all subjects, how the British drink their tea. That was fascinating. Mahan, you do like to dip your toe into almost anything, don't you? And tackling the whole tea subject, that's a big one.
Well, it's a really funny thing. I noticed that tea, like wine, I mean, you basically get two kinds of personalities. You get either the kind of person who says, I like this wine and you don't, therefore, you're Pol Pot or something, right? You're a bad person. Whereas there's the other kind who says, well, I like my tea this way, you like yours. Maybe this represents different cultures. As it happens, the piece that got published, you all know this as writers, it got cut by 50%. So there was so much else that I wanted to say on the topic. And, but hey, it's one of those, and it was for an online publication. I was like, I don't think there's a space issue here, but
very
whatever.
Strange.
Well, I can see the writers have turned purple.
But also, maybe the editor just didn't agree with her. Given that it's such a controversial subject, how you take your tea.
It is. Tea is kind of, it's one of those things kind of like plutonium enrichment and who's your favorite member of Westlife? Those kind of, I know, I believe Richard's is Shane.
Definitely. Yeah. And in fact, I can't really name any of them. Sadly, but anyway,
good for you, Tommy. You have kids, so who knows who their band will be.
Absolutely. Will there even be bands by then? It'll be an interesting one. Now, look, this subject, top 5 myths of classical music. There's so much to talk about within our industry as far as this is concerned. How did you go about picking your top 5?
I just panicked 2 days ago and thought of about 20 things that annoy me, which took me about a minute. and then I picked 5 randomly. No, honestly, actually, Tommy, I was on a flight back home and I did it on the flight basically. And I thought actually about what are those, I think the space for solipsism, as we know in our industry, is huge. So it's, important to remember what are those things that people say in other parts of the industry. They might be broadcasters, they might be writers, they might be other musicians, they might be younger musicians, older musicians, programmers, whatever. And what are things that they say that sometimes you think, now, wait a second, that, from my perspective, that can't be true. So I think it's not so much an issue of myths as things that in my experience seem kind of absurd or ridiculous, or I disagree with. I don't have the absolutism that I did in my 20s. It's given way to a sort of dialectical fascism. So, we'll see how that works.
But what I find interesting about you, and I want to explore this a little bit later, is that you are a busy performing musician, and lots of people out there will be wanting to employ you in halls and stuff. And we're in a position now where a lot of people are very sensitive about the way in which things are said and the way in which things are phrased. And a lot of musicians are slightly afraid of saying their own opinion because they're worried that the people who employ them might not agree with them and therefore decide not to employ them.
Look, man, I'm a known quantity by this point. Like, if I got this far with this, then whatever. I'm not going to call for like the invasion of Iceland. Like, it's not, there are limits. I'll say that in a private chat, obviously, but, openly is another thing. No. I think that, and I'm not being an idealist about this. Actually, we may as well start with the first myth, if I may.
Please, yeah.
Which is that there's this notion, and you often hear it said by maybe people who are a little frustrated with the industry, this notion that careers are created by PR and by record companies. You still hear this in 2021. And, based on that supposition, people say, well, if you say the wrong thing or don't have the right opinions, that you'll get nowhere in this business. I mean, I think that the business, it's small, but it's also big enough that there's a kind of musician for every kind of listener. And I was reading something the other day that was talking against definitive recordings and definitive performances. And the problem with definitive is that, well, there's a kind of person who wants to hear Glenn Gould. There's a kind of person who wants to hear Turek. There's a kind of person who wants to hear Trevor Pinnock. There's, I think, a person out there who wants to hear me. Like there's all kinds of, my father used to say there's a dirty old man for every dirty old woman. And like, and I think, but also the industry isn't set up the same way anymore to sort of create someone a la sort of Citizen Kane's wife. I don't think that happens anymore, but maybe you feel differently.
I mean, there was certainly a time, wasn't there, in the early 90s, we've talked about this before on the podcast, where so much of what was happening was basking in the glory of the success of Nessun Dorma and Pavarotti at the 1990 World Cup. Suddenly, record companies were pushing forward people who weren't necessarily at the top of their profession, but looked good and had that kind of connection, in whatever way you want to interpret it, with a broader audience. So they were kind of made by PR and by record companies.
I'll push back on you on that in the sense of, there's this thing called staying power, right? Which is something that I think is not imparted to younger musicians sufficiently. Yeah, sure. There's people around for 2-3 years, 5 years, 10 years. But, fundamentally what you really want as a musician, unless you don't need to work for money, which is fine, which is what you really want, is staying power. I think something that's really, there's a very well-known pianist who I'm very good friends with, who I had dinner with a couple of years ago, and he was complaining in private at this dinner about like, finally the New York Times did a thing on my recital, finally there was a feature, finally this got a review. And I thought, mate, you're such a big deal that your staying power for 25 years in the industry is itself, and like, who cares whether they wrote about you? Like the point is that when your name comes up, musicians are all like, oh, that's a really serious musician. You've made a very good income doing this. Everybody knows who you are. There's no doubt that your competency and that your that your aesthetic interest as a musician is paramount. And I think that's much more important than let's say a well-known English language organ writing about an opera singer's Twitter account. Like, who cares? I think that there's more. And frankly, if they do write about said singer's Twitter account, it's because they've had staying power as a performer. I think at the end of the day, there's no one on stage who survives who hasn't done something amazing at one point.
And talent will always out. We have to stand by that, don't we? Certainly in our profession. Charlotte, one of the things that came up this very week, in fact, Andrea Bocelli sang at the opening of the Euros, and the usual kind of big wave of what I think is really rather snobbish attitude towards him came tumbling in. I thought it was quite interesting because actually, although he's, I think most of us would probably agree he's not a particularly good singer, he is incredibly popular with a certain audience out there. And there's nothing wrong with that. As Mahan was saying, there's room for everybody, right? But he is a product of PR to a degree, but it's got to be more than that. There's got to be more than that. Once the PR has moved away, people do still really love him.
Yeah, they do. And it's funny, that leads to one of my myths, but actually I'm going to respond by just bouncing off what Mahan has said. I agree with everything that he said and that you have said. I would add to that, first of all, the fact that careers can sometimes be destroyed by PR and record companies. You can take a really great musician who's really promising, And they might put, I mean, actually, even yesterday, I was reviewing an album from a very promising young violinist who had done a previous strong concerto disc on one major label. And then she'd moved to another major label and done a strong, meaty recital disc. And then her orchestral debut had come out on this same major label. And it's playlist fodder. There's no meat on the whole thing. You don't get to the end and have any idea of what this young person has to say, because ultimately, if you pick music that has nothing to say, you can't say anything with it. So I think that there is a real problem when a record label get their claws on somebody who looks right and then try to push them into avenues that have no integrity, or that don't have the longevity that Mahan is talking about, because there's nothing to grasp hold of. So that would be my first point. And then the other one, I mean, linked to one of my other points, was that I think that they do create careers for people who don't necessarily deserve it. You say talent will out, but not necessarily always. So for example, on a number of occasions, I've gone and heard an artist live for the first time. They sound great on their major label. And then you turn up and you cannot believe how ropey they're sounding. And Patricia Kopachinskaya told me a really interesting story a few weeks back on this. She went and did a recording. She didn't mention the label. And she went into the sound booth afterwards and they played it back to her. And she was like, that's not me. That doesn't sound anything like me. It's perfect. The tone is different. It's kind of warmer, and all the glitches have been ironed out. Turned out the engineer had put on something called a honey mic. And this is apparently prevalent across the industry. And she said, well, take it off. And they took it off and she went back and recorded again. And it sounded like her, warts and all. And that's what she wanted. But I think so often you get these, particularly people who fit the bill, who look right, who have the right image, who have the right tick boxes for whatever thing. And so the record company puts them into a spot, switches on the honey mic or whatever, or you can do so much with editing these days. I mean, when you can edit out a semi-quaver that isn't quite right, I think that somehow the wrong people get put up. And then of course it's all going to come crashing down 5 years later, because again, no longevity, because they don't actually have what is needed to sustain a career.
But it's thrilling, I think, Richard, when a musician comes along who's pounced on, usually by Decca, at a very early age, and packaged, and you just know what's going to happen. They're going to do a video and they're going to be playing a popular song just to connect with another audience. But this is exactly what happened with Sheku Kanemason, who I thought, when I saw him in the finals, string finals particularly, of Young Musician of the Year, I thought, this guy's the real deal. Actually, he's a fantastic musician and I just know what's going to happen. There's going to be a process that he goes through. But actually, I think he has come out of the other side of that a bit now. And I think he is properly being taken seriously as a musician rather than just a well-marketed one.
I mean, is the power of the record industry one of the myths in its own right? I mean, we all talk. There's these two things going on there. There's a world of music with live performance. So we're all lucky to go to live concerts regularly and play in them, participate in them, listen to them, write about them. And then there's this record industry, which perhaps, in our distant youths, maybe even earlier than that in Mahan's case, was this all-powerful sort of behemoth, dominated by these big players like Deutsche Grammophon and Decca in the 80s, in the 70s, where fortunes were being made. Karajan was flying into Salzburg on his private jet with his entourage and being whisked through town in a limo. All that sort of nonsense is going on. It's not the case anymore. I mean, we had this discussion once at a board meeting at the CBSO. People were very worried. A concert had been taken live for a recording by a record label, and people were getting very worried. The audience were not sufficiently respectful of this. They were making noise, they were coughing, they were turning patient programs, and they should be absolutely briefed that this is being recorded and you need to keep out of the way. And someone piped up and said, well, this recording, how much is it going to sell globally if it's a really successful classical recording? Saying, well, 1,500 to 2,000 discs. So we've got 2,100 people in the audience who have paid to hear us live. Which takes priority here, please? It's what matters? What's the real thing here? And I think that. Not obviously the record industry is enormously important, and certainly in terms of building profile, in terms of building reputation, careers. But I think, like you mentioned Sheku, as you say, anyone can hear that he's an interesting a charismatic, convincing performer when you hear him live. The other thing you notice when you hear him live, I've heard him live a few times now, is the connection with the audience, which is unmistakable. The warmth that emerges, the absolute willingness that the audience has to sort of get to listen to him, to give him a fair try, to sort of get on side with anything he's doing artistically. And then, of course, there's those recordings, which I think have been a mixed bag. I mean, understandably so. He's been sort of pushed. You get the sense he's been pushed into playing things sooner than perhaps he would naturally have wanted to record them. Perhaps they've been, I mean, certainly one of them has been, I'd say his Elgar was very badly overproduced, as you say, glossed up, personality taken out of it. And then, the opposite of hype, of course, is just counter hype. The PR, they're being recorded young, they're getting glossy adverts, getting a lot of coverage. There must be nothing to them. This must be puffed up. Nothing. If you've heard them live, that's not true. But let's have. I know quite a few young artists who have good reputations, have high reputations, and record deals, and are fairly famous. Who, when you hear them live, come across as engaging, but also complex, maturing, changing artists, developing artists. You don't get that in recording. You get that snapshot, primped and preened, and sort of put out there with the marketing. And if you're naive enough to think the snapshot, what the record industry is putting out, is the reality. It's the truth of what an artist is, of what they might become, of what their connections with the audience. You probably deserve what you get. Really, you're always going to be disappointed and sour, because you're by saying that all hype is bullshit is as ridiculous as saying it's believing all the hype. It's the only way to go and hear them.
But our industry, Mahan, is it's always suspicious of success, isn't it? Massively so, and it seems outrageous, really, in a way, that somebody who is marketed brilliantly at the beginning and becomes very successful almost has to prove themselves to the industry that they are in fact the real deal, which seems crazy.
I would say that much of that reflects the sort of bourgeois anxieties of the people writing about music. I mean, obviously present company accepted. But I mean, I by the way, I just wanted to say, Charlotte, I'm very much with you on those points. I think they're both great points, which I had not considered. One thing I would want to push back on is, and I think it's just an issue of the language that we use to talk about these things. I think I would never want to be in a position of saying who does and doesn't deserve a career. I think that's really weird. It's weird wording, right? Like I don't think we found the right wording for it. But I think I could, in musicians, there's the classic sort of musicians sit in the canteen and talk about other musicians, right? But I mean, I couldn't possibly judge who deserves and doesn't deserve a career. I mean, for example, and I think a lot of that moralism, and I'm not saying that you're being moralistic, but I think a lot of that moralism comes from, for example, so one of my pet topics is Bach, right? And obviously I'm very interested in the world around Bach and everything. And if you look at so a lot of the chatter around Bach comes from about 2-3 generations after him. So around him, no one's really talking about him that much. The sons talk about him a little bit. Well, I mean, the one son who was sober talked about him a little bit. And then 3 generations later, they chatter about him. And of course, things change. And one of the things is, starting with sort of Zelter and Mendelssohn's generation, there's this notion of, oh, poor Bach, he's such a good German, he's so true to the traditions, but people don't appreciate him. And why don't people appreciate him? Oh, because, Germany is so, overrun with foreign musicians, because there's so much French and Italian music, because he was a good Christian, because, so many of these things. And I think a lot of that language gets adopted into even people like Wagner, write this way about Bach and his generation, that, in order to be a true musician, there's this, what's that thing that Charles Mackay said about, like, if you have enemies, then you haven't done anything, right? And so there's this kind of triumphal moralism around people who are deemed to have not been appreciated. The logical end result being, of course, that the people who were appreciated were, they may have had their day, but there's something morally, sort of iffy or off about them. And but I very much agree with what everyone has said here. It's very interesting.
Let's have another myth, shall we?
Oh, well, while we're at it, I think someone on Twitter the other day posted about Leslie Howard's the box set that he did for Hyperion of, like, I think it's 8 billion CDs of Liszt, right? Like something like give or take. And about how, how he's a great composer. And I love Liszt music. and about how, he's the great show off. And I thought, oh, there's an interesting myth kind of embedded in there, which is this notion that sort of performer composers, Rachmaninoff, Liszt, Scarlatti, John Bull from an earlier generation, that they're somehow, they're sort of showmen first, but that somehow the profundity of the music isn't there. And I think there's a myth to be unpacked there about, like, is a composer sort of removed from performance and traditions of entertainment? And so it's kind of like one of those things where there's a question and answer session, and the moderator says, "So what's your question?" I don't know. I'm just posing that as a sort of myth there. But
yeah,
it is an interesting one, actually. And Liszt, of course, ultimately gave up performing because it wasn't giving him the freedom to compose all the serious stuff that he wanted. And you can hear all the shades of it, even in his beautiful transcriptions, the showy transcriptions of the popular tunes that he would wow people with at the end of his concerts. But he gave up performing purely because he wanted to be serious.
So wait a second. That's not wholly true, actually.
Well, serious, spend more time developing form then.
Sure, but I think to say the word serious, I think you may be putting words in his mouth.
Yes, oversimplified it there.
So
because the thing is,
why is it a myth then? This idea of the performer composers only doing show pieces, is it because they happen to be their most popular pieces?
Oh,
I mean, I don't know whether they really do. I mean, they obviously do in some. I mean, and clearly.
Hold on a second. Now, writers, would you say either the writers in the room that the Liszt popular works that you review or that come across your desk are more the piano works or the orchestral stuff?
Piano works, but I would say that they were composing those pieces into a very particular concert climate. A particular thing that audiences wanted, and you see exactly the same thing with Wieniawski, the violin virtuoso composer. He was composing, the variations on tunes that the audience would love, but he was also composing concertos, and people struggle to take him seriously now because he was so virtuosic. But that was actually part of his style, and at the time it wouldn't have been seen to be all froth. And it's a beautiful melding of all of those elements when you look at something like his violin concertos.
It's an interesting one, Liszt, isn't it? It's an interesting one, Liszt. I was writing about this just a couple of weeks ago. Like, in fact, he's vanished. I don't go to many piano recitals. I tend more to go to orchestral concerts. It's just the way things sort of fall out. And Liszt doesn't come up. If someone does Les Preludes, that's kind of seen as a rarity now. Whereas I think 3 generations ago, maybe more recently than that was a popular classic. That was a sort of Friday night's music night piece. That was something you'd have on your 100 best classics. It was something that Mickey Mouse cartoons would feature. It was, every cartoon in the 1940s, they wanted to demonstrate classical music, would have someone doing a Liszt Hungarian Rhapsody in an orchestral version. These pieces, which I think some people still call them war horses, aren't there anymore. The sort of orchestral side of Liszt is a real rarity now. If you put on the Faust Symphony or the Dante Symphony, you can expect a half-filled hall, and you've really, really got to push for it to sell it at all. And I think clearly the emphasis has fallen back on his piano music, exactly the sort of virtuosic stuff that I think once was not taken seriously. And I think maybe because pianists love it so much, because there is endless fascination what he gets, what he finds between those notes, what emerges from the virtuosity, what emerges, what is the sort of imaginative possibilities opened up by his technique. And I think pianists love recreating that, and people do perhaps take that more seriously than they used to. But the orchestral music, the stuff, symphonic poems, the stuff, as Charlotte says, but he sort of, in his later life, this is his great legacy, his great contribution to world music, that at the time was taken more seriously, possibly. That's all kind of gone, and I think it's weird.
Isn't it also that Mahan, we like the stories, don't we, attached to these great personalities like Paganini, Liszt? We love the idea that these guys were sort of slightly out of their minds, and they could improvise, and so much of what they wrote down is kind of based on, we like to think, of improvisation and showing off. And we love those stories, so we're going to attach ourselves to those stories more than perhaps to the rest of the repertoire.
I think you're right, but I think that what we lose as a result, in the case of Liszt. Now, Charlie, you mentioned Wieniawski. I have to confess, other than one concerto, I don't really know very much about him. So I'm quite ignorant about his music. Of course, I know Paganini's music. But I think in the case of Liszt, And incidentally, in the case of Scarlatti, Domenico Scarlatti, we have two composers who actually are such massive musical innovators that actually, had they written for any other form and any other genre, it would have been just as innovative. Now, it's interesting, when I think about that for Liszt, I think about that for the orchestral music more so than the piano music, although obviously the B minor sonata is a magnificent work, right? But I mean, for Scarlatti, in those 600 sonatas, which I think a lot of nonsense gets said about them, mostly because a lot of nonsense gets said about them in the performances. Scarlatti is an innovator on a Beethovenian sort of Lisztian level. I mean, he does things with harmony and with the sort of gray area between performance and sort of the theoretical world of notation that, I mean, Bach couldn't have done in his sleep. I mean, he wouldn't have imagined such a thing, in other words. And I think because, in the case of Liszt, of course, we have the narratives of him performing. In this case of Scarlatti, he probably just played him in private. I mean, we have no notion of Scarlatti as a public musician. And what's really funny is that if you look at Scarlatti's public music, which is to say the operas, and there's a Stabat Mater, which is actually quite nice. Basically, his other music is pretty ordinary. I mean, it sounds like any other early 18th century Italian composer. And I wonder whether, it's funny, again, going back to Liszt, I've mentioned this in many interviews, there's this book, which you guys have got to get if you don't have, which is it's various notes from his masterclasses in Weimar. Super interesting book. And remember, there was this label, Arbiter of Musical Traditions. The guy who ran that put me onto this book. And Liszt spends the whole time in the masterclasses talking about poetry and talking about Dante and talking about, aesthetics and philosophy and really high things. And it could be actually that maybe the reason why he spent his last years at the piano in the company of his sort of intellectual equals was because he felt that because he couldn't say those things to the public anymore. I don't know, but it's really interesting. Liszt is, and I don't think it's insincere, Liszt is incredibly high-minded in the last 10 years of his, I mean, okay, he gives his daughter to Wagner, but no one's perfect. But I mean, basically it's really amazing. And I think actually Rachmaninoff is a very good example of that. Again, how much Rachmaninoff piano music comes across your desk, but then how many recordings of the bells?
Oh, I love the bells. What a great piece that is. I want to bring everything down a little bit, although I never think of it as that. Sorry. By mentioning Freddie Mercury, because I'm a huge Queen fan, but what really annoys me is
also Iranian. He's another Iranian.
Of course,
we're very proud of him. Yes.
Everyone always talks about what a great showman he was. What a great showman. And they talk about his
composer.
And they talk about what a colourful private life he had, and that's all they ever talk about. And what they forget, and I know this annoys the other members of Queen, is what an amazing songwriter he was. And actually, that to me is the important bit. Some of those songs are extraordinary, and it's not just about Bohemian Rhapsody. There's just acres of great music that he wrote, very sophisticated, beautifully handled, beautifully composed. That's what I want to talk about when we talk about Freddie Mercury.
But speaking of other genres, then, I mean, the true musician and creator in The Doors was Ray Manzarek, but everybody talks about Jim Morrison,
of course,
right?
Well, because he also died, and that's always the thing.
Ray Manzarek did finally die.
He did, yes. but Jim Morrison died slightly in a more interesting way. So people love that, don't they? People love that, and I mean, it's the same with John Lennon. A myth is created around them, especially if they die young. I mean, that's the way of it. And I guess that's the case with Paganini. It's the case with Liszt. They're not necessarily young, but that's what happened, right?
Fortunately, we still have Yoko to annoy us.
Yes,
but yes, it's true.
Okay, let's have another classical music myth.
Okay, so I think there's this notion that classical. When I say there's this notion, I mean there's a notion currently amongst the chattering classes that the business myths or the talking points that we discuss within the industry, between us, that somehow these are the same thing as reality. right? So there's this confusotomy over, for example, just the other day I saw an article with a statistic about new operas that have been done since 2000, I think. And if you talk amongst people in the industry, you know, Berlin is the new center of everything. Germany is the new center of everything. You know, Britain is, you know, on the, you know, level of relevance of Belize. And you know, all the new music is being done there. But of all the operas done in the last 21 years, this article was saying, the vast majority are in English and by British composers. And I think the list was like, you know, Jonathan Dove and Thomas Adès and, you know, and three other people now whose names I've forgotten. And of those, all those major operas, I think only 2 had been seen in new productions in Germany. So, and yet we have this kind of D.H. Lawrencean sort of anxiety about, oh, you know, the English language world is being taken over by Germany, or what's that? Because literally 5 people will say things at a dinner, generally within zones 1 to 3. And then somehow that becomes a reality of classical music. Like I saw an article the other day, which I have to say, I quite disagreed with the tone of the article about sort of the classical music elites and what they think of Vaughan Williams. Now, Vaughan Williams is a composer that I came to fairly late. I quite shared in the sort of received wisdom about him. But you know, I just listened to the evidence, and I remember Symphony Number 8 coming on. There's the recording by RLPO with Andrew Manzi conducting, and I was listening to some Vaughan Williams in my living room, and then Symphony Number 8 came on, and I was like, that is not what I thought Vaughan Williams. Like I was like, is this Lachenmann? Like what's going on here? And it was and I just sat there totally transfixed by this music. And I think it's there's a tendency in the industry to not see or hear what's right in front of us, but to kind of repeat these things that people keep on saying to one another and sort of accepting them. And I don't know, I have a problem with that.
Yes, I mean, Vaughan Williams, Richard, I know has a lot to say about this sort of thing, but Vaughan Williams,
he helped me.
But being labeled, you know, cowpat music, for example, it does often feel like there's that small number of people who have decided that that's what Vaughan Williams is like, and therefore that's what it becomes, and it then spreads out, doesn't it? Out of zone.
Well, you know, a line gets established, a line gets decided, perhaps generations ago, and it gets repeated and repeated and repeated because it's quicker than actually listening, quicker than actually forming an opinion. I mean, taking a totally benign, harmless, and apolitical example of this, one of my favourites is I still occasionally do program notes for children's concerts, playing the William Tell Overture. Children, you might recognise this from The Lone Ranger. Now, I think The Lone Ranger was last shown on British television, I think 3 years before I was born. I'm right.
It's on YouTube.
But all the books in the 50s, all the textbooks in the 50s that people grew up on, all the sort of outdated books that people were learning from still in the 70s and 80s when they're forming their current, the current generation critics. They told them that this is why it was famous and it was well known, and they just keep repeating it without, you might recognise Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker from the Cadbury's Fruit and Nut advert. I think that was last shown in 1976. I was 3 years old. I never saw it on television, and so on. And this goes on all the way down the line. The received opinion gets baked in very, very early, and people just repeat and repeat and repeat. They click for an opinion. They find the first one that comes up. They find, and it's quite. Yeah, I mean, it's not surprising what happens with any art form, what happens with any aspect of culture, doesn't it? But, it's essentially laziness. You do have to actually listen. You have to be willing to listen with a fresh pair of ears and try and listen to the evidence of your own ears, really. And I mean, I'm interested. I've been doing a bit of work for the last few weeks on Malcolm Arnold's music, which is something I love anyway, something we all love. I had the privilege to hear his Fifth Symphony performed live. And I spoke yesterday to Zachary Oromo, who's due to conduct his Fifth Symphony at the Proms. And he said, well, he's just curious about the music, and he just sat down and listened to all 9 of the symphonies, and said just listening to it, immediately struck by how communicative it was, how clear it was, by the quality of it, and the fact it hadn't been performed at the Proms. And I said, well, did anyone at the BBC kick back? No, they were delighted. But
we all but Richard, we all know, don't we, that even though Zachary says that, what actually happened was he listened to this podcast where we've been banging on about the Fifth Symphony of Malcolm Arnold for almost a year, and he thought, fine, we should definitely do this piece. That's definitely what happened.
But I think the narratives get baked in, and I mean, I sort of, I feel with Malcolm Arnold now, perhaps the idea that he was sort of this great victim of this big establishment conspiracy and this against music with tunes in the 60s and 70s is probably an element of truth, as there are in most myths. But I think it's not a useful argument anymore, but it's kind of become baked in. It's become, things get polarized when people just sort of take these simplistic views. Vaughan Williams is cowpat music. Well, no, he's not, clearly. It's just an attitude to take, isn't it? It's just
convenience.
Prevents you thinking, prevents you listening, which is a real thing. I wish people just listen to the damn stuff. I mean, almost any composer of any quality, you'll find multitudes. You'll find all sides of a human personality in a composer's work. You'll find, if you want Elgar that's patriotic and stirring and melodious, there's plenty there. There's also plenty of dark, troubling, complex, astonishingly intimate, so almost avant-garde. It's all there to be found if you look for it, if you listen for it. And I think, it's not wanting to see people, artists in the round, not wanting to understand that people are complex.
It's hard though, Richard, isn't it? Charlotte, it must be hard when you're sitting down to review a recording of a very popular piece that's been recorded many, many times before. It must be incredibly hard to remove yourself from everything that's ever been written or said about that piece and genuinely come at it with totally fresh ears. I mean, virtually impossible, presumably.
Yeah, it is. The one really good way of doing that is to get the score out and listen to it with the score and see what you're noticing in terms of the textures, the key changes, all of that. It kind of cuts out a lot of the rubbish if you're doing that. And I think when it comes to these myths that build up about composers, I think as with newspapers, where you have to read every newspaper knowing what that particular newspaper's bias is. If you're going to get to the nub of the story, don't just read the strap line. You've got to read the thing, and you'll find the information in there, but there's a lot of bias to get through first. And I think we talk about Vaughan Williams. This was a reactionary thing. It was people with an agenda. It was Constant Lambert, Elizabeth Lutyens wanting to break out of everything that Vaughan Williams and Elgar and people stood for, and that was where it was coming. It was coming through the British serialists. Trying to make a stamp on things in the 1940s. So you always, I think you have to look at where the source of the myth came from. And that, again, is another way of sorting out the wheat from the chaff, if you like.
That's a brilliant point. I think, likewise, maybe I always feel if I don't understand something, I mean, a mentor of mine used to say, you cannot dislike what you don't understand, right? And if I don't understand something, then sometimes reading and learning about things that are totally unrelated will somehow lead me to that. So in the case of, I mean, for example, what brought me on to Jane Austen, whom I revere as one of my top favorite writers ever, and by the way, who was revered by all of 19th and 20th century as one of the greatest writers ever, was that it's kind of like one of those very claustrophobic Handel operas where all of human emotion and relations between humans are explored between 7 people, right? And Jane Austen is telling us that she can look at the world through the relations between women and their mothers, between fiancés, in a very small portion of society. It doesn't really, she wrote of the world that she knew, right? The world that she had experienced. I mean, now we call it lived experience, and I don't want to get into that. But I mean, she wrote of that. And I mean, so Vaughan Williams or Malcolm Arnold, what you're going to blame them because they weren't somebody else? I mean, it doesn't matter. As I said about Scarlatti, Malcolm Arnold, had he been from, I don't know, Latvia, chances are he still would have had the same observations, the same things to say. And I think that's what for me about the Fifth Symphony is so moving, is that he can pay tribute to people that he knew in a way where when I listen, especially to the third and fourth movements, I think of people that I knew. I mean, I think Dutilleux is very much the same way. There's this kind of quality of sort of ghosts always sort of appearing in front of your face with Malcolm Arnold's best music. And it's not about, this is something that the kind of sort of woke generation and people saying that, unless something has to do with my personal experience, it's not relevant. What they miss is that great artists use personal experiences to inspire you to reflect on your own, which you don't share with that artist. Right. And I think that's so valuable about that music.
There's a myth I wanted to bring in, which I've mentioned a little bit before on this podcast, but I think it's an important one to mention here. The myth in classical music that everything is amazing and that everything is important. Now, as a former Radio 3 presenter, I, like all of us, have tended to fall into this trap of always presenting every piece as if it's a masterpiece. The fact that we are playing it must mean it's an utter masterpiece. And of course, not every piece can possibly be a masterpiece. Now, this has had consequences, I think, over the years, because we've started to think that everything has got to be amazing, because all of us are representing our entire industry every time we open our mouths or write something down on a piece of paper. And I find this to be incredibly dispiriting. It's having a major consequence, I think, on the way in which we listen to music and consume music, because people are afraid to really say what they think. I don't particularly like people booing at concerts or at opera and stuff like they do so often on the continent when they are displeased with a performance.
How well I know.
But sometimes you do wish people would express themselves better and more clearly if they really don't like something. I hate the modern way of broadcasting where everything has to be amazing, incredible, extraordinary, passionate, and all that stuff. And this is, I think, bled into a lot of classical music presentation now, and I really, really, really don't like it. I've never felt that it was the presenter's place to tell me what they think about the piece, because who cares? Because all the people listening, they'll all have their own opinions about what that piece was like and what the performance was like. So it doesn't really matter. But it goes beyond that, I think, for me. I think we are a bit afraid to be critical, and we have been. Richard has talked about this in the last year, when, of course, the whole industry has really needed support. Of course it has. But we've got to get to a point now where we're prepared to be properly critical again. There you are. That's one of my myths.
One of the things I find most difficult about my job with program notes is when I'm sent a commission and the piece is just frankly a bit half-baked. And I don't know why they programmed it. Probably they programmed it because not many people program it and because it's the right length. And it's really hard to sit there with this piece where there is literally nothing. It was an early work. It's just not that great. And somehow you have to make it tell people it's worth listening to. I hate that.
But I think sometimes there's also music that serves a place within the context of programming, right? So in the case of, for example, there was, I'm really into collecting the recordings of the old harpsichordists. And there's a recital, I think, from the Frick collection, kind of at the end of her career, of Landowska. So it's like the late 1940s or something. And, she plays these big works by Bach and, Bird and Scarlatti and people. And at the beginning of the second half, so after the interval, she plays this little suite by Handel. It's not one of the 8 great suites. It's a kind of sort of afterthought suite that was published later on. And, it's not a great work. I mean, you could not sell it as a masterpiece. It most assuredly is not. But for that moment, it works so perfectly well. And I think there's this that things within the way people listen to music and what they expect of an evening or a daytime concert or whatever of music. I think that if the problem with the masterworks discourse is that it ignores how we listen to and process music as entertainment. And I think recently I had this issue. I recorded. I don't think Hyperion will mind me telling that I recorded the notebook for Anna Magdalena that Bach compiled in the 1720s. And there's a very interesting collection. There's mostly keyboard pieces, and then there's a few vocal pieces, which I did with Carolyn Sampson, who was amazing. And I did most of the keyboard pieces on the clavichord, and then a few things on the harpsichord. And the funny thing about this collection is that it's not really clear how many of the pieces Bach wrote. Like there's a piece by Couperin, there's a piece by Johann Adolf Hasse, but then the rest of the music, it's not really, it's quite maybe some of the music he didn't write. Now, thinking whether he wrote it or didn't write it, frankly, changes the way people talk about it and the way people play it. Because if you think that Bach wrote it, then then people don't add ornaments, and then people drone on in reviews about like, oh, he wasn't true to the composer, or he was true to the composer, or like I have heard. Look, I listened this morning because I got my vaccination to a recording of the Well-Tempered Clavier. Don't need to say who it is, some major player, and it was on for 45 minutes, and I didn't hear one phrase. So then I went to the reviews of it, and people are like, oh, so true to the traditions of the composer, and I'm like, really? Like if it just so happened that the 48 came down to us and it was by Telemann, you wouldn't that would be laughed off stage. People will be ornamenting it right and left, either because they think that the music needs help, or and this became most obvious when, for the Goldberg Variations, in the 70s, a copy of the Goldberg Variations turned up that had Bach's own corrections to the publication, and he had written the corrections in red ink. And I remember playing them for my teacher. She had recorded them before this was discovered in the 70s. And I added Bach's own ornament. She said, no, that's too much. No, that doesn't, no, that's disrespectful to Bach. And I was like, again, it's because it's by Bach, that we expect a masterpiece is untouched by the performer. Mm-hmm. And
well, one of the last things I wanted to say about that subject was I went to the book launch of Humphrey Burton's memoirs last weekend, and as an introduction, he showed some clips from his career, and one of them was an interview he did with Glenn Gould, where Glenn Gould was playing extracts from Schubert, I think, and he was demonstrating why he was playing it much faster than everybody else, or indeed much slower than everybody else, and why he was doing it. It was very interesting. But Humphrey said at one point to him, he said, "Are you sure that's right? Why are you doing it like that?" Now, I liked that because you cannot imagine a modern BBC TV classical music presenter saying that to someone like Glenn Gould at all, because everything is amazing. So they would say, they would just say, "Oh my God, that's just so beautiful." I can hear these people saying that right now. Whereas Humphrey had a lot more integrity, I think, in that, and it was a different time, but he actually he stands up to Glenn Gould and challenges him, which is of course what Glenn Gould wanted, because he's that kind of person. And he was off then. He could talk about the subject. It was brilliant. Richard, it's not just me that thinks this, right? I mean, it's just I find it so frustrating.
I just want to be a bit devil's advocate here. I mean, I've absolutely been in the same boat as Charlotte many times. I've been asked to write about pieces of music that I don't personally like, rate, or think merits the position in the program they've been given, but they have. The point is, by the time I'm taken on, that decision has been made by the artists. The artists are championing these pieces. They feel it's worthwhile. They're charging people money to come and listen to them. My job is to make it clear to those people why they should have spent that money, why that money has been well spent. It's not my job to tell them you've just bought a piece of shite. It's
no, but it's not your job to tell them it's a masterpiece either. I mean, to be honest, I think it's a slightly different. It's a slightly different thing, though, isn't it? Because your job is to tell them about the music, not to tell them what you think of it.
There are ways of saying it, really. I mean, and Donald Tovey was just, this is the motto fixed of my desk. He says, "A program note writer is counsel for the defence. You're a professional who has been retained to make the best possible case for this object, this piece of art." And that's what I always bear in mind when I'm writing, even if I don't particularly like the piece myself. I mean, talking to the wider point of, as you say, fabulous, amazing. I do think classical music in the past sort of 2 decades, and maybe this is me being old here, but it's been caught in this kind of arms race of emotional impact. The stakes have been raised. We're in this world where it's surrounded with high intensity experiences, art forms more exciting, louder, flashier, more immediate, more ubiquitous, all absolutely promising to give us phenomenal experiences all the time. And classical music has to match that. So all of the rhetoric has become life-changing, shaking, utterly profound, utterly sublime, and this has kind of had a knock-on effect in repertoire. What Mahan said about that little Handel suite, the light music, the small music, music that's merely entertaining, music that's merely pleasant, music that might have a place in a program without necessarily being life-changing, has been driven out. There are fewer and fewer concert overtures. You'll never hear a ballet suite by Delibes or someone like that in a concert program these days. There's this kind of, a colleague of mine once told me they couldn't sell a ticket. They're having trouble selling tickets for Brahms symphonies now because audiences expect to see at least 100 players on stage, some offstage brass, ideally a chorus, quadruple woodwind, or they feel they're being shortchanged emotionally. They want whopping great impact all the time, and this is a problem, I think. And I think it's possibly a symptom of the wider culture we're in. We're having to literally shout louder and put across a more simplistic message because we feel challenged. We feel we have to hold our own in that world. Should we feel we have to be? Are we comparing like with like? Should we not just simply let the music speak, do what it says, expect that people will find their way to it,
yes,
enjoy it,
yes,
as they always
yes,
have? Maybe we should. Yeah, I think I know your answer, Tommy. Yeah,
we need to move on. Mahan, another myth from you.
I think a tremendous myth in classical music is that, quote unquote, serving the composer means somehow removing the human self of the interpreter. I think that's quite an insidious myth.
Go on, expand on that then.
Well, I mean, vis-a-vis my point with Bach, right? With this notion that some music more than others deserves us to be sort of clearly objective in spite of whatever the historic context is for that music and the performance of that music, but also that somehow the highest calling of the interpreter is to always, serve the composer, even if we have no evidence that the composer had that expectation. And I find the moralistic language around that, I find that it enables very uninteresting people to feel like they're doing something important.
Yes, I not necessarily under that banner, but I remember seeing the LPO do Rite of Spring with Jurowski, and it felt to me that Jurowski had put a lot of effort into doing the fast bits slow and the slow bits fast, to put it in very simple terms. And actually, it really irritated me. I absolutely hated the performance and bounced up and down in my chair because of it. I felt very uncomfortable because I felt that it wasn't doing it for the right reasons. It was sort of saying, look, these are just notes and I can interpret them in whatever way I want. And I don't have to serve the composer. But actually, of course, Stravinsky is one of those composers that was quite specific about what he wanted. And tempo are always going to be argued about. Of course they are, unless they're very specifically put in metronome marks. But even then, there's an interpretation there, isn't there? But that just seemed to me to be, I don't know, just trying to turn things upside down just to do something with a piece that was incredibly well known.
Yeah, but you know what, though? It could be, I mean, I quite like Jurowski. It could be that it's also him reacting at the fact that we use the great works, phenomenon as a sort of morality car wash. That we see this as a way to, I mean, I find this particularly insidious with the Chopin competition, for example, in Warsaw, where I try to follow the finals and everything. And there's this notion in Poland, a very heavy notion of like Chopin traditions, right? And the traditions from the teachers. And this kind of encasing of the composer in marble, which is impervious to ego, is just sort of false, really. I don't think that, I mean, and it makes you think, people around I hate to make this comparison, but, there are people right now around the world trying to save, the climate and trying to vaccinate people and save the world. And here we are in classical music, judging the relative morality of whether someone hasn't done something by the book. And I can see for a conductor of Jurowski's intellect, that being an incredibly frustrating backdrop to one's interpretive decisions. But I didn't hear the performance, so I can't say, obviously.
No, and I must say I'm a huge fan of Jurowski's. Actually, I think it's terrific. I think he did some fantastic things with that orchestra. It was just that particular. I mean, I love that piece, and everything. It just felt tokenistic to me, and it was the reason I mention it is because it felt disrespectful to the composer rather than simply doing something that you feel is within you that's so important.
I feel that.
Sorry, the other two. Just I think we should just go to your last one, Mahan, because we're
Oh no, I'm
running
sorry.
we're running out of time. No, it's fantastic. Let's go to your last one, and we can all have a go at that one.
I think there's a great confusion over what the achievement of the Western musical tradition is. And I think that there are people who try to adopt it for their own agenda. So you have one group of people saying, well, the Western musical tradition is impervious to change, and that's what its greatness is, that it's somehow timeless or it's universal. And then you have another group on the opposite side of the spectrum saying that, the Western music tradition shares in the crimes, real or perceived, of Western culture, Western civilization. And I think that really comes from an inability to talk about music. I think that we talk around music. So it's very easy to say nonsense when you talk around something. But if we talk about music itself, I feel very strongly that, so the achievement of Western notation, right? That we have developed, a tradition of notation has been developed in which something can be written on a piece of paper, and that with at least the best examples of it, you can look at that piece of paper and know what was in the heart and the mind of someone 300 years ago. I think that's such a massive intellectual achievement. And I think if we learned more to talk about the building blocks of that, then we wouldn't sort of find ourselves in a tizzy, sort of trying to cancel each other out, basically.
Yeah, well, this is the hot topic of the moment, isn't it? The sort of so-called cancel culture. I vaguely remember there was an article, wasn't there, about some meeting at Oxford University about, we should ditch modern notation because it's related to the slave trade, or God only knows what it was.
A lot of it has been misreported and overreported.
Of course, they absolutely love a story like that.
Sure.
Of course, we know that. But Charlotte, it's a dangerous area now, isn't it? I mean, just looking at what Mahan was saying about going back in history and looking at things that we hold to be of great value, we now have to question it entirely.
Yes, and I think that the notation debate, it's not new. It's been raging for decades in academia, and we have to remember that. And thankfully, we do still have Western notation. New pieces are written in it every single year, quite a few actually. But it's a danger, and I think the biggest danger actually is for the next generation. We're all sitting here in our 40s, and we did our fugue, we did our 4-part harmony. I think there is a huge danger actually for current students that the cancel culture will get into their particular education, that it won't be compulsory. It is actually possible to get an A, I think, music GCSE and A level without being able to read a note. You can just do other things. And I think that the danger is that when those people, having not made the right options, made the Western notation option, then get 10 years down the line and realize it would really help them if they could let that other performer know exactly what they want that performer to play, just by writing a few little dots on 5 lines. And I think the danger is actually, it's the next generation. We're all fine.
Richard?
Well, where to start with this? It's just as I say, Matt, it's the way we talk about music. It's difficult. It's very, very hard for us to engage with the emotional content, with the heart of it, what it means to us, what it means to us individuals. It always feels very, very personal. It's this collective act which actually feels like a very, very intimate, a very individual experience every time you encounter it. At the same time, it's all you've experienced en masse. It's part of a group, it's part of a social process, and it's people feel they're coming under personal attack when something they love is attacked or questioned, even validly questioned. Everything must be repeatedly re-examined. What to say, really? Notation has its uses, doesn't it? I worked with a Sri Lankan classical composer in the 1990s for a couple of years. He was putting together an opera. He wants to put together a 3-act music drama lasting 2 hours, filling an entire evening, and working with a mixture of Western classical musicians and Sri Lankan traditional musicians and popular musicians. Basically, I think I was literally the only person there who could read Western notation, and he wanted me to sit there and just try and write everything down so he had a document of what he'd created so he could duplicate it, which exactly, that's what he wanted to do, this artist, but he didn't have the equipment to do it. I thought that was quite interesting. Also, the fact that it took us collectively coming together, I think we spent something like 5 hours that day putting together, I think, the first 4 minutes of music for that piece. And I say, a boring old imperialist Western symphony orchestra sitting down with their prescriptive sheet music could have done that in 4.5 minutes. I don't know, it has its uses. That's a side issue. That's a side issue, really. I think this question, how we talk about music, is a huge one. I keep being drawn back to Richard Taruskin as a scholar who always intrigues, enrages, fascinates, and amuses me in equal measure, really. And he wrote an article many years ago about the death of Klinghoffer, the John Adams opera, and whether or not demands that it should be banned, that it should be censored, whatever, had validity. And he said, well, he doesn't personally agree with that. It's not his side of thing. On the other hand, if music has the power we claim for it, has the importance we claim for it, has the significance we claim for it, which Western philosophers going back to Plato also claimed for it, it does affect people. It does affect the way they behave. It does affect people's attitudes, thinking, emotions, and therefore has a bearing on society. Therefore, society has a right to regulate it. And it is conceivable that music could be socially dangerous, even harmful. And the logical conclusion of all that is that perhaps it should be regulated. It should sometimes not be played, not be made. We would all find that shocking and outrageous. But then possibly, we haven't really thought through that chain of thought. I don't have an answer to that. I really don't have an answer to that. It sticks against all my sort of liberal Western sort of 20th century thinking, to sort of think that anything should be censored or stopped in that way. On the other hand, we do claim that music has this power. If it really does have that power, should that power be regulated?
Charlotte?
Well, I think there is a flip side to all of this, which is I think that those of us steeped in the Western classical music tradition don't always take other music traditions seriously enough. I bitterly regret.
Hardly ever, in fact.
Well, yes, I bitterly regret. When I was doing my music degree, I did a term, I think it was just a term of ethnomusicology. And I'm the first to admit I didn't take it seriously enough. And that was wrong of me. And thankfully, some of it did still lodge. And so, I know a little bit about quarter tones. I can hear things. But for example, one of the young composers I'm particularly interested in these days, in his late 20s, Benjamin Attahir. And he's serialist with Arabic influences. And he's using all sorts of interesting quarter tones and Arabic inflections and gorgeous stuff. And I know I would understand where a lot of that came from better had I frankly opened my ears a little bit more in my brain and received more during that precious term at university.
I did want to say, though, I mean, I totally get what you were saying, Charlotte, about the what we did at A levels with music is very different to what they're doing now. And it's true that the disciplines are sort of fading away. Of course, that's true. But actually, I don't think it is actually true that you can pass A-level music without reading music, but you certainly can do GCSE.
It was 10 years ago.
It has changed, I think, a little bit. But what has changed for the better, I think, is that a lot of the approach is that Western classical music is not the only music, and that a lot of other cultures do come into music education now. I mean, music education is a whole other show, but it's certainly true that a lot of it now, you do hear about hocketing and all sorts of and all the microtones and all the rest of it, and improvisations that go into Indian music, into whatever, everything around the world. I think they are much more open to that now than they were when I was at school. Certainly, there was a tiny little bit of it, but really it was entirely based around about Western classical music. So maybe there's some hope in there that ears are wider open. Who knows? We won't know for a generation, I would imagine. Do you want to come back on any of that stuff, Mahan?
Well, I think that fundamentally the Western intellectual tradition is one that over time has honed into a highly receptive form of inquiry. I mean, there's a reason why when Westerners went out to explore and sometimes exploit the rest of the world, they were curious about other languages, and they were curious about other cultures. They were curious about other musics. They were curious about other art. And to dismiss that all as some sort of product of a, of an adversary, sort of malicious stance, I think misses the point entirely of exactly what the achievement of this is. Now, I don't think that our job as musicians or as writers or academics in music, it's not to make people like or dislike music. But I also don't agree. There's musicologists who always say, my only job is to make people think critically about music. No. Like, that's a cop-out. Like, I think that there's some sort of happy area in between this. And I think, but again, this goes back to my first point, which is that the things that are chattered by people over a dinner table are not the same thing as reality. Just because a few people decided at a dinner table or at a department drinks that that the next fad is what defines the world doesn't mean that the world is going to buy into that. And I think it's very dangerous to confuse the discourse on social media, even in regular media, with how people actually respond to art. I think we're in a fascinating position right now where we are very much not only behind what people really think, but that there's a kind of willful keeping out of sync with reality, and that perhaps that has something to do with the current zeitgeist of rejecting whatever is not in one's direct experience. We're not listening to each other. We're really not listening to people, and that goes as much for me as for anyone else.
Totally agree. So much to take away from today's podcast. Thank you so much, Mahan.
Thank you. I've taken so much from everybody here. Thank you.
It's brilliant. Thanks so much for joining us. Just tell us what you're up to next. We saw you at Wigmore Hall and Sarah Connolly very recently. That's still available, I think, online to watch. But what's next?
Well, I mean, I just did the Partitas with Hyperion, which came out last week, I guess. Oh. And I did Clever Ubuntu for them, which will be out. And then I go to Bruckner House in Linz. And then I'm off until the proms, baby.
Whoa.
So which is great. I'm going to have a summer kind of off. So
and the proms?
Oh, yeah. August 17th, I think, with Manchester Collective. And we're doing Joseph Horowitz's Harpsichord Concerto. Yeah. Which is amazing. He is so great. He wrote it for George Malcolm, and I tell you what, your fingers can feel he wrote it for George Malcolm. So
he's really a great composer.
He is a great composer, and he's a total mensch. And I'm glad that now people are taking him seriously because it's well overdue.
Absolutely, it is. Thank you, Mahan. Okay, well, the next edition of Classical Top 5 will, in fact, be our last, and we're going to be celebrating the 14 months of our podcast with some of our favorite guests returning. What are your favorite moments from our podcast? Your favorite guests, the music that you perhaps have discovered? Let us know, as always, on our Facebook page or on our Twitter feed, and I'll try and include as many of your memories as possible. Thanks again to Mahan Esfahani for joining us, and always to Richard and to Charlotte. See you then.